Meet the cooler Master Masterbox 540. It's big, it's sturdy, it got an automotive-inspired front panel RGB design. But somebody forgot about air. So this is the cooler Master Masterbox MB540. But before we dive deep, let's go over the main features. This 500mm long, 209mm wide and 500mm high mid-tower case comes with support for up to 80x or E80x motherboard size. For the CPU cooler, we can go with the really big things with support for up to 165mm high CPU coolers. For the GPU, we can go with up to 410mm long cards, so basically every card in existence. In terms of drives, we can mount up to two 3.5 or 2.5 inch drives inside of the drive cage in the back of the case. Additionally, there is space for another two 2.5 inch drives behind the motherboard tray by using these little rubber knobs which Cooler Master includes in the bag of goodies. The power supply is also sitting in the bottom of the case and can be up to 180mm long. Fortunately, the right side of the drive cage is removable, allowing to use much longer power supplies which are up to 295mm long. That's a really good feature, although it kind of annoys me that I cannot just remove the whole damn thing. A mini gimmick about the PSU orientation is that you can install it both ways. Underneath the case there is a dust filter allowing the PSU to be installed how we are all used to do it. But inside of the MB540, Cooler Master made sure to include vents on top of the PSU tunnel, which allows you to install it with the fan facing up. Now this feature is a bit complicated. It's a good thing if you use passive power supplies or power supplies with fans which start spinning at a certain temperature level. That way you might be able to dissipate a bit more heat because it will be traveling up inside of the case. The other scenario in which I think this might be useful is if the PC is running in a really dusty place or place with a ton of animal hair. That way you won't have to take care of the bottom filter all the time and you'll be sure that the PSU always runs somewhat clean. But the problem with this method is that in this scenario the PSU and GPU will be fighting for air. So beware that every orientation has its ups and downs. In the back of the case we will find 7 reattachable PCIe brackets. For cable management, besides the mandatory cable cutters around the motherboard area, Cooler Master included 3 rubber cable hiders for the chunky cables. In the back we will find a ton of zip tie holders for the included zip ties, as well as around 2 to 2.3mm of space for your wires. For the cooling part, Cooler Master already included one of their SickleFlow 120 ARGB fans in the back. And as our dedicated SickleFlow review showed, those are really good fans, so nice job here. For the rest, the MB540 allows for up to 3 120 or 2 140 fans in the front, 3 120s or 2 140s in the top. Both the front and top allow for up to 360mm size radiators. So we are looking at the case with support for up to 7 120 fans, 2 360 radiators in the front and top, and 1 120 in the back, which is pretty good, but we will talk about that in a minute. The I/O is absolutely up to date with 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A, 1 USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type C, separate audio in and out, and an RGB button. And of course the Cooler Master shaped start button. And to finish off the featured part, by removing the single screw in the top of the case, we can clip out the enormous tempered glass side panel. Okay, let's now go over a couple of interesting points, starting off with the top fan panel. Generally, installing hardware inside of the MB540 was a pretty easy job as it is rather big for a mid-tower case. The top panel with support for 320mm fans and a big magnetic dust filter on top did not make any particular trouble. But something that I really enjoyed is that the complete top part of the case is removable with just 2 screws. This made it extremely easy to mount radiators on there, and even if you don't want to go with water cooling, you can still take it off, sit down and easily mount your fans without doing it with these self-threading screws in an annoying position. But that's really not all. Because the top is now exposed, it becomes an ease to hook up the CPU power cable. And if you've built inside of a really small case, you know how much of a pain in the ass that can be. But I'm still not done. It can also be a huge advantage if you're working with really massive CPU coolers. Let's take the Be Quiet Darkrock Pro 4 as an example. If you would want to upgrade your current CPU cooler, let's say the stock AMD one, for something like this, you would never be able to do so without at least removing the GPU or maybe even the whole motherboard. Installing a cooler like this is an easy task, but to install it you need to screw it down before you slide in the central fan from either the top or the bottom, something that you normally are not able to do inside of a semi-finished build. With the MB540, however, it's really easy because you have all the space available above. And all of this creates a surprisingly useful building advantage, as well as providing you with a really easy after-build maintenance possibility. So really good job, Cooler Master. Now let's get to the tricky part of this case. The front panel and the RGB. They managed to do such a really good job and such a really bad job at the same time. First off, the MB540 comes with an included ARGB controller and splitter, which is already pre-installed to the front panel, so you will just need to hook up the sickle flow fan in the back to the splitter, connect the controller to power, and boom, Unicorn power. Additionally, you can connect the case reset button to the controller, which lets you switch the modes with the controller from outside the case, which is pretty nice. Now, I won't be going over the design of the RGB front panel. I can see why they call it automotive-inspired design, but it's design. Design is subjective, so this is how it looks, you like it or you don't. Just know that the RGB implementation looks pretty nice. You are not able to distinctively see an LED light, and because the front is covered in like strip-like forms, the fade from top to bottom effect looks pretty cool. But if you like it, that's up to you. What I want to talk about is the good and the bad about the front panel. Let's start off with the good. These pins. Instead of routing an annoying cable to the front LEDs, Cooler Master used a couple of pins and some PCB which start to make contact as soon as you reinstall the front panel. This is an amazing approach and should definitely be industry standard. No annoying cables, and you can take off the front panel wherever you want without it being physically bound to the rest of the chassis. Really good job, Cooler Master. Now on the airflow. Really bad job, Cooler Master. The fans which are supposed to draw air into the case are almost completely glued to the front panel, which is sealed by all of that plastic. Sure, there's a tiny air pocket in front of the fan and air gaps on the sides, but the upper 2 fans are physically unable to reach the air vents. So what good are they for? The lower fan is the only one which may be able to somehow reach the air vents, but it is also the fan with the least amount of effectiveness, as it is just blowing air straight into the backside of the drive cage. Sure, it's a good thing for the hard drives, which I won't be using, but what about my poor GPU and CPU? Now, I don't want to exaggerate here, but this is bad. Like, it's really bad. It might not look immediately that bad because the sheer size of the case and amount of fans might dampen the effects a bit, but those 2 upper fans are basically useless. But let's try them out. We installed a Ryzen 5600X locked at 4.3 GHz and 1.4 V-core with a Darkrock Pro 4 and an EVGA 2080 Super inside of the MB540. Then we slammed 3 of our Arctic P12s in the front, left the Sickle Throw 120 in the back as it is, and let every fan spin at 100% fan speed while hammering the CPU and GPU. With the front panel installed, the CPU stayed at 83 degrees C, while the GPU stayed at 79. Just by removing the front panel, these numbers changed to 73 on the CPU and 73 on the GPU. That's 10 degrees C on the CPU. That's way too much. Sure, the Darkrock was able to keep it in okay state all the time, but that's an enormous cooler and just a tiny CPU. So you can definitely expect these numbers to be much worse if you do not exaggerate completely on the cooler. I don't want to say that the airflow inside of the MB540 is unusable. It's really big size, helped it out, but in my opinion, you should be using this case only with water cooling. The lack of any effective front air intake would put a really hard workload on the CPU cooler, and if you're using, like, let's say a 360mm all-in-one, it might be working more effective with more air restriction, and I would also recommend to install it in the top while letting the front fans pull the air in that they can. With all of that being said, what about the build quality? Well, to be honest, I was expecting a bit of a cheap feeling case because of all of that plastic, but in the end I was pleasantly surprised. The metal used in here is pretty thick without any wiggle, the feet are massive, strong and high, and even if the front panel is basically 100% plastic, it doesn't feel as cheap as you might expect. Okay, so let's sum up the good and the bad. The good: build quality, feet, I/O, removable top panel, included ARGB controller and splitter, CPU cooler and GPU support, the cableless RGB system, cable management, and most importantly, the amount of water cooling support. The bad: front airflow. The top is perfectly fine and amazingly designed, but the front airflow is just bad. So who is this case for? In my opinion, water cooling users. I do believe that using an air cooler in here is just ineffective. Sure, it will work, you saw that it will work, but it will basically work because it is massive. You might help it a bit by rotating the back fan to be an intake fan, but other than that, there will not be much air to take in except for the top sucking in through every little crack in the case. If you really want, sure, but I would absolutely recommend to use a massive all-in-one. The MB540 is currently available at around $165 on Amazon US and around 120 euros here in Europe, which I do think is quite expensive for the airflow. Of course, I will leave all of the manufacturer and affiliate links down in the description below. But yeah, this was my take on the Cooler Master Masterbox MB540. At this point, I would like to thank Cooler Master for sending me over this beautiful yet airflow restricted case. But if you want to keep watching, have a look at the MB340. It's a bit smaller, but also way cheaper. Anyway, thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.